The morning sun cast long shadows across the skeletal remains of what had once been downtown Denver, its golden rays illuminating the twisted metal and shattered glass that littered the empty streets. Kalen Thorne pressed himself against the cold concrete wall of an abandoned pharmacy, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air as he listened for the telltale shuffle of the undead. 3 months had passed since the outbreak began, 3 months since the world had crumbled into chaos and humanity had been reduced to scattered pockets of survivors clinging to life in a world that no longer belonged to them. The silence was deceptive. Kalen knew better than to trust it. He had learned that lesson the hard way when he lost his younger sister, Mira, to a horde that had emerged from what they thought was an empty subway tunnel. The memory still haunted him, her terrified screams echoing in his mind as he was forced to leave her behind, knowing that stopping would mean death for both of them. Now, at 28, he had become something he never thought possible, a killer, a survivor, a ghost moving through the ruins of civilization. His radio crackled to life, the static barely concealing the voice of Zara Nightingale, the woman who had somehow managed to keep their group of 17 survivors alive through sheer determination and tactical brilliance. "Kalen, report. Did you find the medical supplies?" Her voice was steady, professional, but he could hear the underlying tension. They all carried it now, the constant awareness that each day might be their last. "Negative on the antibiotics," he whispered into the device, his eyes scanning the street ahead. "But I found something else. There's movement 3 blocks north, organized movement." Human. The word felt strange on his tongue. In this new world, encountering other humans was often more dangerous than facing the infected. Desperation had turned ordinary people into predators, and trust had become a luxury none of them could afford. Zara's response was immediate. "Fall back to the rendezvous point. We'll discuss this with the others." The radio went silent, leaving Kalen alone with his thoughts and the ever-present danger that lurked in every shadow, behind every broken window, within every darkened doorway. As he began his careful retreat through the maze of abandoned vehicles and debris, Kalen's mind drifted to the group waiting for him at their temporary shelter, an old subway maintenance facility they had discovered 2 weeks ago. There was Bjorn Ehrenfeld, a former construction worker whose massive frame and gentle nature made him both protector and comforter to the younger survivors. Serafina Cross, a doctor who had saved more lives than she had taken, despite the terrible choices this new world had forced upon her. Dante Ashworth, barely 18 but already hardened by loss, his parents among the first casualties when the infection reached their small Colorado town. The group also included families, Cashin and Luna Reeves with their 8-year-old daughter Isla, who still drew pictures of flowers and sunshine despite the horror surrounding them. Marcus Silverstein, a former teacher who had taken it upon himself to continue educating the children, believing that preserving knowledge was as important as preserving life. Vera Mondane, elderly but sharp, whose decades of experience had proven invaluable in their struggle to survive. Each person represented hope, a fragment of the world that had been lost, a piece of humanity worth fighting for. But Kalen also knew that their small group was living on borrowed time. Resources were becoming scarcer, the infected were growing more numerous and somehow more organized, and winter was approaching. The cold would bring new challenges, new ways to die that had nothing to do with teeth and claws. A distant moan echoed through the empty streets, followed by another, then another. The sound sent ice through Kalen's veins. He had heard it before, the call of the infected, a sound that somehow communicated across their ranks and drew them together like a malevolent symphony. But this was different. There was something almost musical about it, a rhythm that suggested intelligence, purpose. Kalen quickened his pace, moving from shadow to shadow with practiced stealth. Behind him, the moaning grew louder, more coordinated. Whatever was happening in the city, whatever had drawn those organized humans north, it was about to collide with something far worse. And his family, for that's what the group had become, was caught directly in between. The war for survival was about to begin in earnest, and Kalen Thorne feared that this time, humanity might finally lose. The subway maintenance facility buzzed with nervous energy as Kalen delivered his report to the assembled survivors. The space, once used to service the city's underground transit system, had become their fortress, a maze of concrete corridors and steel doors that could be sealed against intruders, both living and dead. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, where children's drawings hung alongside crude maps marking safe routes and danger zones. Zara Nightingale stood at the center of the group, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, green eyes sharp with intelligence and determination. At 32, she had emerged as their natural leader not through force, but through an uncanny ability to make the right decisions when everything seemed hopeless. She listened to Kalen's report with growing concern, her fingers drumming against her thigh, a nervous habit she had developed since taking responsibility for so many lives. Organized humans moving north, she repeated, processing the information. And you're certain they weren't infected? The question hung in the air like smoke. In the early days of the outbreak, the distinction had been clear: humans fled, infected pursued. But as weeks turned to months, the lines had blurred. Some infected had begun displaying primitive coordination, while some humans had descended into savagery that made them indistinguishable from monsters. Bjorn Ironfeld shifted his massive frame, the metal chair creaking under his weight. His beard, once neatly trimmed for construction work, now grew wild and unkempt, but his pale blue eyes remained kind despite everything they had witnessed. Could be military, he suggested, his Norwegian accent still thick despite 20 years in America. Maybe government finally got organized, Ja. Hope flickered in his voice, the same hope they all carried like a dying flame, that somewhere, someone in authority was working to restore order. Dr. Serafina Cross shook her head, her dark skin gleaming with perspiration despite the cool underground air. She had been working tirelessly to treat minor injuries and illnesses with their dwindling medical supplies, knowing that something as simple as an infected cut could mean death in their current circumstances. If it were military, they'd be moving differently. More structured. What Kalen described sounds like scavengers, maybe raiders. Her voice carried the weight of experience. She had seen what desperation could do to people, how quickly civilization's veneer could peel away. Dante Ashworth leaned against the wall, his young face already bearing scars both physical and emotional. The loss of his parents had transformed him from a carefree teenager into someone who viewed the world through a lens of barely controlled rage. "Does it matter who they are?" he asked, his voice sharp with barely contained anger. "Anyone moving in groups that size is either very confident or very dangerous. Probably both." Luna Reeves pulled her daughter Isla closer, the 8-year-old clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that had somehow survived their flight from the suburbs. Luna's husband Cashin sat beside them, his accountant's mind now focused entirely on calculating odds of survival, resource allocation, and the terrible mathematics of life and death. "We can't fight other humans," Luna whispered, though her words carried to everyone in the confined space. "We can't become like them." The statement sparked immediate debate. Marcus Silverstein, the former teacher whose gray hair had turned completely white in the past 3 months, nodded emphatically. "Luna's right. The moment we start killing other survivors for resources, we lose what makes us human. We become the monsters." But Vera Mondane, whose 73 years had given her a pragmatic view of human nature, disagreed. "Idealism is a luxury, dear," she said gently. "Sometimes monsters are all that survive." As the argument continued, Kalen found himself studying the faces around him. These people had become his family through shared trauma and mutual dependence. They had saved each other countless times, shared their last morsels of food, risked their lives for strangers who had become loved ones. But he could see the strain wearing on all of them. The constant vigilance, the never-ending fear, the gradual erosion of hope, it was changing them, hardening them in ways that might be necessary for survival but terrible for the soul. A sudden sound from the facility's perimeter cut through their discussion, the distinctive scrape of metal against concrete, followed by a low, rhythmic tapping. Everyone froze. They had established these sounds as warning signals, ways to communicate without using radios that might be monitored. 3 taps meant infected approaching. 5 taps meant human contact. This was 7 taps, their emergency signal for immediate, overwhelming danger. Zara was on her feet instantly, hand moving to the pistol at her hip. Positions, she whispered, and the group dispersed with practiced efficiency. Adults moved to defensive positions while children were shepherded to the innermost chamber they had designated as their final refuge. Kalen checked his rifle, counting ammunition he knew was too precious to waste. Bjorn hefted a massive wrench that had become his weapon of choice, while Dante drew the hunting knife that had saved his life more times than he cared to remember. The tapping continued, more urgent now, and was joined by another sound that made their blood run cold, the coordinated moaning Kalen had heard in the streets, but louder now, much louder. It wasn't just a few infected wandering aimlessly. This was a horde, and they were being driven toward the subway facility with purpose and direction. Through the facility's reinforced windows, they could see shapes moving in the darkness above ground. Too many shapes, too organized in their movement. Zara's worst fears were being realized. Someone or something was using the infected as weapons, herding them like livestock toward their shelter. The battle for survival had found them, and they were no longer the hunters. They had become the prey. The first infected reached their outer perimeter just after midnight, their shambling forms illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the subway entrance. But these weren't the mindless wanderers Kalen and his group had grown accustomed to avoiding. These moved with purpose, their decaying hands clawing at the reinforced barriers with a coordination that defied everything they thought they knew about the infected. Zara crouched beside the observation window, her heart hammering as she counted the shapes moving in the darkness above. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all converging on their position with an intelligence that sent ice through her veins. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows, she could make out human figures, living people directing the horde like shepherds guiding a flock. They're being controlled, she whispered into her radio, knowing that every member of their group was listening. The infected are being herded. This isn't random. The implications were staggering. If other survivors had found a way to control the infected, it changed everything about their struggle for survival. It meant that the undead were no longer just a force of nature to be avoided, but a weapon that could be wielded by those ruthless enough to use them. Bjorn Ironfeld had positioned himself at the main entrance, his massive frame blocking the reinforced door as the sounds of clawing and moaning grew louder from the other side. His construction background had helped them fortify the facility, but he knew that no barrier was impregnable. Given enough time and pressure, even the strongest defenses would fail. "How long you think we have?" he asked, his Norwegian accent thicker with stress. Dr. Serafina Cross was moving between their wounded, two survivors who had been injured in recent scavenging runs and couldn't be moved easily. Her medical bag was already packed with their most essential supplies, but she knew that if they had to evacuate, some hard choices would have to be made. The infected didn't take prisoners, and neither would the humans controlling them. "We need an exit strategy," she called out, though everyone knew their options were limited. The subway tunnels stretched in multiple directions, but most led to areas they knew were heavily infested. In the children's area, Marcus Silverstein was doing his best to keep young Isla Reeves calm while her parents prepared for what might be their final stand. The former teacher had fashioned a small puppet from scraps of cloth, using it to tell stories that transported the 8-year-old away from the horror pressing in around them. But even his gentle voice couldn't completely mask the sounds of their defenses being tested by increasingly aggressive attacks. Dante Ashworth had taken position at the rear entrance, his young face grim with determination. The loss of his parents had left him with a burning need for vengeance against both the infected and the world that had taken everything from him. His hunting knife was sharp, his aim with their few remaining firearms was true, but he knew that anger alone wouldn't be enough to save them. Still, if they were going to die, he was determined to make their enemies pay dearly for the privilege. A sudden crash echoed through the facility as something heavy struck their main barrier. Then another. The infected were using tools now, or being directed to use them. Chunks of concrete and metal debris were being hurled at their defenses with increasing accuracy and force. Zara realized with growing horror that their attackers weren't just controlling the infected, they were improving them, making them more effective as weapons. "We're not dealing with ordinary raiders," she announced over the radio. "These people have been studying the infected, learning how to enhance their capabilities. This is organized warfare, not desperate scavenging." The revelation changed their tactical situation completely. They weren't facing random violence or even calculated cruelty. They were up against someone who had embraced the apocalypse and turned it into a tool of conquest. Varamondain, despite her age, had proven surprisingly adept at electronics, using her decades of amateur radio experience to monitor communications. Her weathered hands worked quickly across their improvised radio equipment as she searched for any intelligence about their attackers. "I'm picking up signals," she reported, her voice tight with concentration. "Military frequencies, but the protocols are wrong. These people know government codes, but they're not government." The implications sent a chill through the group. Military deserters with knowledge of official procedures and access to equipment would be incredibly dangerous opponents. They would have training, organization, and resources that far exceeded anything their small group could match. Worse, they would have no qualms about using the infected as weapons, having already abandoned the moral constraints that kept most survivors from such tactics. Another impact shook the facility, this one strong enough to knock dust from the ceiling and rattle their equipment. Through the observation window, Zara could see that the infected had formed human pyramids, allowing their companions to reach higher points on their defenses. The sight was surreal and terrifying, the undead displaying cooperation and problem-solving abilities that suggested their controllers had found ways to enhance their cognitive functions as well as their aggression. Cassian Reeves, his accountant's mind racing through calculations of ammunition, time, and odds, reached a conclusion he didn't want to voice. Their position was becoming untenable. Even if they could hold out against the current assault, their attackers had demonstrated capabilities that made long-term survival impossible. They needed to either break out immediately or find a way to negotiate with their besiegers. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew negotiation was unlikely. Anyone who would use the infected as weapons had already crossed moral boundaries that made peaceful coexistence impossible. This was conquest, pure and simple, and their small group represented resources to be claimed rather than people to be reasoned with. The siege was only beginning, and already their situation was desperate. In the darkness above ground, their enemies were patient, methodical, and utterly without mercy. The ultimate battle for survival had begun, and humanity itself hung in the balance. Dawn brought no relief to the besieged survivors. If anything, daylight revealed the true scope of their predicament. Through the reinforced windows, they could see the infected arranged in precise formations around their facility, standing motionless like soldiers awaiting orders. Behind them, the human controllers moved with military precision, setting up equipment and establishing a perimeter that made escape virtually impossible. Zara felt the weight of leadership pressing down on her like a physical burden. Every decision she made could mean life or death for 17 people who had put their trust in her judgment. The responsibility was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that she was making it up as she went along. Leadership manuals didn't cover scenarios involving weaponized zombies and rogue military units. The attack came without warning. A sharp whistle echoed across the area, and suddenly the infected surged forward with coordinated fury. But this wasn't the shambling advance they had grown accustomed to. These creatures moved with purpose and intelligence, using tools and tactics that defied everything they thought they knew about the undead. Bjorn's position at the main entrance became the focal point of the assault. The massive Norwegian found himself facing infected that wielded makeshift weapons and worked together to dismantle their barricades with frightening efficiency. His construction experience had prepared him for many things, but not for undead that could problem-solve and adapt their tactics in real time. "They're learning," he shouted over the radio, his voice strained as he braced against the door that was beginning to buckle under the coordinated assault. "Each wave is smarter than the last. They're testing our defenses and adapting." The revelation was terrifying. If the infected could learn and improve, then every encounter made them more dangerous, every defensive strategy less effective. Dr. Serafina Cross was treating a head wound Dante had sustained when debris from the assault had struck him, but her supplies were nearly exhausted. She had been rationing antibiotics and painkillers for weeks, knowing that once they were gone, even minor injuries could become death sentences. "We can't sustain this," she announced grimly. "Every person we lose makes us weaker, but our enemies are growing stronger." The infected had begun using the bodies of their fallen as building materials, constructing crude ramps and platforms that allowed them to reach new angles of attack. The sight was horrific beyond description, the undead treating their own remains as tools, displaying a pragmatic callousness that spoke to intelligence without humanity. Marcus Silverstein continued his efforts to keep the children calm, but even his gentle presence couldn't completely shield them from the reality of their situation. 8-year-old Isla Reeves had stopped drawing her cheerful pictures, instead clutching her stuffed rabbit and staring at the walls with the hollow expression of someone who had seen too much. The psychological damage being inflicted on the youngest survivors might prove more lasting than any physical wounds. A new sound joined the cacophony of the assault, the distinctive whine of power tools. Their attackers were using equipment to systematically dismantle their defenses, cutting through metal barriers with industrial precision. Veramondane's monitoring equipment picked up radio chatter that confirmed their worst fears. This was a well-equipped force with access to vehicles, weapons, and technology that far exceeded their own capabilities. "They're talking about prisoners," Vera reported, her aged face pale with shock. "They want some of us alive. They're discussing experiments." The word hung in the air like poison. The implications were clear: their attackers weren't just raiders seeking resources. They were conducting research, using other survivors as test subjects in their efforts to understand and control the infected. Dante Ashworth's position at the rear entrance came under assault from a new direction as infected began emerging from the subway tunnels themselves. The young man found himself facing creatures that moved through the underground passages with the confidence of familiarity, suggesting that their enemies had been studying the facility for much longer than anyone had realized. "We're surrounded," he reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "They've been planning this for weeks, maybe months. We walked into a trap." The realization hit everyone like a physical blow. Their sanctuary hadn't been discovered by chance, it had been chosen for them, a place where they could be contained and controlled when the time came for harvest. Cashin and Luna Reeves exchanged a look that spoke volumes. As parents, they faced a choice no one should have to make: risk everything in a desperate escape attempt, or surrender to uncertain fate in the hopes that their daughter might somehow survive what was coming. The mathematics of survival had become personal, and the equations offered no comfort. Zara made a command decision that would haunt her regardless of its outcome. "We're breaking out," she announced over the radio. "Gather essential supplies only. We leave in 5 minutes through the eastern tunnel. It's our only chance." The order was met with grim acceptance. Everyone understood that staying meant certain capture or death, while running offered only marginally better odds. As they prepared for what might be their final desperate gambit, the sounds of their defenses failing grew louder. Metal shrieked against metal, concrete cracked and crumbled, and through it all came the coordinated moaning of the infected, a sound that had evolved from mindless hunger into something resembling a battle cry. The infected weren't just attacking their position anymore. They were claiming it, marking it as conquered territory in a war most survivors didn't even realize was being fought. The ultimate battle for survival had revealed its true nature. This wasn't humanity versus the infected, but humanity versus those who had chosen to rule over the apocalypse rather than simply survive it. In the growing chaos, as their sanctuary crumbled around them, one truth became crystal clear: the real monsters weren't the infected shambling outside their doors. The real monsters were the humans who had learned to use horror as a weapon and had embraced damnation as a tool of power. The eastern tunnel stretched before them like the throat of some great beast, its concrete walls slick with moisture and decades of accumulated grime. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically, casting dancing shadows that made every step treacherous and every corner a potential hiding place for horrors beyond imagination. Zara led the desperate procession of survivors through the underground maze, knowing that behind them, their sanctuary was being systematically torn apart by creatures that had once been human. The group moved in single file, each person carrying only the most essential supplies. Bjorn Ironfeld brought up the rear, his massive frame serving as a living shield between the vulnerable and whatever might follow. His construction-hardened hands gripped a crowbar that had become his weapon of choice, its weight familiar and comforting in a world where comfort was measured in momentary reprieve from terror. Serafina Cross struggled with the moral weight of the decision she had been forced to make, leaving behind medical supplies that could save lives in favor of mobility that might preserve them. Her physician's oath to do no harm had been twisted by necessity into calculations of acceptable loss, and the compromises were eating at her soul even as they focused on survival. The children's labored breathing echoed through the tunnel, each exhalation a reminder of how precarious their situation had become. Isla Reeves, despite her 8 years, understood that this wasn't another game or adventure. The stuffed rabbit clutched in her small arms had become a talisman against the darkness pressing in from all sides, and her parents' worried whispers carried clearly in the confined space. Dante Ashworth's rage had crystallized into cold determination. The young man who had lost everything in the first days of the outbreak now channeled his fury into protective instincts for the makeshift family surrounding him. His hunting knife remained ready in his hand, its blade reflecting the intermittent lighting like a promise of violence against anything that threatened those he had come to love. A sound from ahead brought the column to an immediate halt, the distinctive shuffle of infected movement, but muffled and distorted by the tunnel's acoustics. Zara raised her hand, and 17 people became statues, barely daring to breathe as they listened to the approaching danger. The footsteps were wrong somehow, too regular and purposeful for typical infected behavior. Marcus Silverstein found himself remembering lessons he had taught about cave systems and underground exploration, knowledge that had seemed academic until this moment when it might mean the difference between life and death. The subway tunnels were a labyrinth, but they also offered multiple routes and hidden passages that their pursuers might not know about. Education, he realized, might be their salvation. Veramondane's electronic equipment, despite being hastily packed, continued to pick up communications from their attackers. The radio chatter revealed a chilling level of organization and planning. Their enemies weren't just pursuing them, they were hurting them, driving the survivors toward predetermined locations where capture would be inevitable. The elderly woman's decades of amateur radio experience had never prepared her for intelligence that could mean the difference between freedom and becoming experimental subjects. The infected in the tunnel ahead weren't random wanderers. As the group pressed against the tunnel walls, trying to remain invisible in the shadows, they could see that these creatures moved with purpose and direction. Someone was controlling them, using them as scouts and sentries in a network of surveillance that covered the underground passages. Cassian Reeves found his accountant's mind working frantically to calculate odds and alternatives. Every route they might take was potentially compromised, every decision a gamble with stakes too high to comprehend. The mathematics of survival had become a deadly serious game of probability and desperation, where the wrong calculation meant not just death, but something worse, capture and whatever horrors their enemies had planned. A new sound joined the symphony of terror, the distant rumble of vehicles above ground. Their pursuers had motorized support, which explained how they had been able to coordinate such an extensive operation. The survivors weren't just being hunted by enhanced infected and rogue military personnel, they were facing a full-scale operation with resources that dwarfed their own capabilities. Luna Reeves made a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. She pulled a small pistol from her pack, checking its ammunition with hands that trembled despite her determination. The woman who had once worried about her daughter watching too much violence on television was now preparing to kill to protect her family. The apocalypse had a way of revealing who people really were beneath their civilized facades. The infected ahead suddenly became agitated, their moaning taking on a more urgent tone. Something had changed in their behavior, some signal or stimulus that activated them into a more aggressive state. Zara realized with growing horror that their enemies weren't just controlling the infected, they were using them as a communication network, passing messages through coordinated behavioral changes. A light appeared in the distance behind them, growing brighter with each passing moment. Their pursuers had found their trail and were following with systematic determination. The choice was stark: face the unknown infected ahead or certain capture from behind. Zara made the decision that leadership demanded, even knowing it might doom them all. "Forward," she whispered, the word carrying through the group like a prayer. They moved toward the infected, weapons ready, knowing that stealth was no longer an option. The ultimate battle for survival had become a running fight through the bowels of a dead city, with every step taking them deeper into darkness, both literal and metaphorical. Behind them, the lights grew brighter, and ahead, the infected began to move with purpose and intelligence that defied every assumption about what it meant to be human. In the middle, 17 survivors fought not just for their lives, but for their souls, and for the right to remain human in a world that rewarded only the monstrous. The confrontation in the tunnel was unlike anything they had faced before. The infected that blocked their path didn't shamble mindlessly toward them. Instead, they arranged themselves in a defensive formation that spoke of tactical intelligence and coordinated planning. Zara felt her breath catch as she realized these creatures were thinking, planning, adapting to their situation with a level of cognition that should have been impossible. Bjorn Ironfeld stepped forward, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent life in the flickering emergency lighting. His crowbar felt inadequate against enemies that could think and plan, but it was all he had. "They're waiting for something," he observed, his Norwegian accent thick with tension. "Not attacking, just watching." The infected stood in perfect silence, their decaying faces turned toward the survivors with an intelligence that was profoundly disturbing. The sound of pursuit grew louder behind them, accompanied by the systematic tapping of equipment against tunnel walls. Their enemies were using some form of echolocation or ground-penetrating technology to track their movement. Dr. Serafina Cross recognized the tactical sophistication of their situation. They were being compressed between two forces, pushed toward a predetermined outcome that someone else had orchestrated. "It's a trap," she whispered, but everyone already understood. The infected ahead weren't randomly blocking their path, they had been positioned there, turned into living barriers that could adapt and respond to any attempt at passage. Behind them, the pursuit continued with mechanical precision, driving them forward into whatever fate their captors had planned. Dante Ashworth's young face was grim with determination as he studied the infected formation ahead. His hunting knife seemed pathetically small against enemies that could plan and coordinate, but his rage burned bright enough to overcome rational fear. The loss of his parents had left him with nothing to lose and everything to prove, a dangerous combination in a world where survival often required calculated cowardice. A new sound echoed through the tunnel, the distinctive whine of drone motors. Their pursuers had aerial reconnaissance, technology that turned the underground passages into a three-dimensional battlefield where hiding was impossible and escape routes could be monitored in real time. Veramondane's radio equipment picked up the control signals, confirming what they all feared: they were facing a coordinated military operation with resources far beyond anything a group of desperate survivors could match. Marcus Silverstein found himself drawing on knowledge from history classes about underground resistance movements in tunnel warfare. The infrastructure around them was more complex than it appeared, with maintenance passages and emergency exits that might offer alternatives to direct confrontation. But every route would be monitored now, every possibility anticipated by enemies who had been planning this operation for months. The infected ahead suddenly parted, creating a corridor through their formation that led deeper into the tunnel system. The invitation was clear, and so was its sinister nature. Their captors wanted them to proceed in a specific direction, toward a destination that had been prepared for their arrival. The survivors faced a choice between certain death fighting impossible odds and uncertain fate walking into an obvious trap. Isla Reeves, despite her 8 years, understood the gravity of their situation with a clarity that broke her parents' hearts. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, finding comfort in its familiar softness while the adult world crumbled around her. Her innocent questions about why the sick people were acting so strange had evolved into a child's acceptance of horror that no one her age should have to bear. Cashin and Luna Reeves exchanged looks that communicated volumes without words. As parents, they faced the ultimate decision: sacrifice themselves to give their daughter a chance at escape, or trust in the group's collective strength to find a way through impossible circumstances. The mathematics of love defied all logical calculation, but somehow still demanded clear choices. Zara made the decision that leadership required, even though every instinct screamed against it. "We go forward," she announced quietly. "But we go prepared for anything." The group began moving through the corridor created by the infected, weapons ready, knowing that they were walking into the heart of whatever trap had been prepared for them. The infected watched them pass with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. These weren't mindless predators driven by hunger, they were sentries, observers, perhaps even guards carrying out orders from living commanders. The implications were staggering. If the infected could be controlled this precisely, then the entire nature of the apocalypse might be different from what anyone had believed. As they progressed deeper into the tunnel system, the sounds of pursuit faded behind them, replaced by a more ominous silence that suggested their captors were confident in the outcome. The hunt was over, the trap had been sprung. What remained was to discover what their enemies intended for the survivors of the apocalypse who had dared to remain human in a world that rewarded only monsters. The tunnel ahead opened into a larger chamber, and in the distance, they could see lights, not the harsh glare of emergency systems, but the warm glow of inhabited spaces. Someone was waiting for them, and whatever they wanted, it had required an elaborate operation involving military precision, advanced technology, and weaponized infected to achieve. The ultimate battle for survival was about to reveal its true nature, and Zara feared that everything they thought they knew about the apocalypse was about to change forever. The chamber that opened before them was a cathedral of horror, carved from living rock and illuminated by banks of fluorescent lights that revealed the true scope of their captors' operation. Rows of cages lined the walls, some empty, others containing figures that might once have been human. In the center of the space, banks of computers and monitoring equipment hummed with electronic life, tended by figures in military fatigues who moved with the precision of soldiers following orders. Commander Elena Vasquez stepped into the light, her uniform immaculate despite the underground environment, her bearing that of someone accustomed to absolute authority. The insignia on her shoulders indicated Special Forces training, but the patch on her arm bore no national allegiance. This was a military unit that had gone rogue, embracing the apocalypse as an opportunity rather than a disaster. "Welcome," she said, her voice carrying easily across the chamber despite the electronic noise. "I've been looking forward to meeting the survivors who managed to evade capture for so long. Your group has shown remarkable resilience and adaptability." The compliment carried undertones of something far more sinister than admiration. Zara stepped forward, her hand resting on her sidearm despite knowing it would be useless against the forces arrayed around them. The chamber held at least 30 armed personnel, all focused on their small group with professional attention. "What do you want?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Vasquez smiled, the expression predatory and cold. "Understanding," she replied. "You see, the infected aren't the random plague most people believe them to be. They're evolution in action, the next step in human development. My researchers have discovered that with the right stimuli, the right conditioning, they can be guided, enhanced, improved." She gestured toward the cages, where shapes moved with the coordinated intelligence they had witnessed in the tunnels. Bjorn Ehrenfeld's massive hands clenched into fists as the implications became clear. These people weren't just surviving the apocalypse, they were orchestrating it, using other survivors as raw material for experiments that perverted the very concept of humanity. His Norwegian heritage included stories of resistance against occupying forces, and those tales had always ended in blood and sacrifice. Dr. Serafina Cross felt her medical oath twisting in her stomach as she recognized the equipment around them. This was a research facility, complete with surgical suites and laboratory spaces where human experimentation was being conducted on a scale that dwarfed history's darkest chapters. The infected weren't victims of disease, they were products of deliberate manipulation. "You're creating them," she whispered, the words carrying across the chamber like an accusation. "The infection isn't natural. You're manufacturing it, controlling it, weaponizing it." Vasquez nodded approvingly, as if pleased by the doctor's deduction. "Very good. The original outbreak was indeed natural, a mutation in a research facility in Atlanta. But we recognized its potential immediately. While governments collapsed and populations fled in panic, we gathered the best minds and began the real work of evolution." She moved to one of the computer terminals, her fingers dancing across keys that brought up displays showing infected behavior patterns, neural pathway mapping, and enhancement protocols. Dante Ashworth's fury finally boiled over, the young man lunging forward with his hunting knife raised, only to be stopped by tranquilizer darts that dropped him to the concrete floor before he could take 3 steps. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, their weapons trained on the remaining survivors with calm professionalism. Emotion, Vasquez observed clinically, is what separates the old humanity from the new. Remove the chaos of feelings, enhance the clarity of purpose, and you create something far superior. Marcus Silverstein watched in horror as Dante was dragged toward one of the empty cages, understanding now that their capture wasn't the end of their story but the beginning of something far worse. The teacher in him recognized the systematic approach being taken. These people were studying human behavior, documenting responses, building a database of information that would help them perfect their process of creating controlled infected. Veramondane's radio equipment, still functional despite their capture, picked up transmissions that revealed the true scope of the operation. Similar facilities existed across the country, each one conducting research into different aspects of infection enhancement and behavioral modification. This wasn't just one rogue military unit, it was a coordinated network working toward a complete transformation of human society. The old world is gone, Vasquez continued, her voice taking on the fervor of a true believer. Governments, nations, the whole concept of individual liberty, all of it failed when faced with real crisis. We're building something better, more efficient, more durable. The infected you've encountered are just the beginning. Wait until you see what we can accomplish with willing subjects. Cassian Reeves pulled his wife and daughter closer, his accountant's mind finally grasping the full horror of their situation. These people didn't see them as human beings to be killed or enslaved, they saw them as components in an experiment, raw material to be processed and improved according to some twisted vision of human evolution. The mathematics of survival had become irrelevant when survival itself was being redefined. The cages around the chambers suddenly came alive with movement as their occupants responded to some unseen signal. But these weren't the shambling infected they had grown accustomed to fighting. These moved with purpose and intelligence, their eyes showing awareness and recognition that spoke of retained humanity twisted into new configurations. They had been people once, survivors like themselves who had been captured and processed into something that was neither fully human nor entirely infected. Enhanced cognitive function, Vasquez explained, noting their horrified fascination. Retained memory and reasoning ability, but with the physical improvements and behavioral modifications that make them ideal soldiers. They don't feel fear, doubt, or compassion. They follow orders with perfect efficiency and never question the necessity of their actions. They are the future of human evolution. Isla Reeves began to cry, her 8-year-old mind finally overwhelmed by horrors that her innocence couldn't process or deflect. Her stuffed rabbit fell from trembling fingers as the full weight of their situation crashed down on her. Her parents' attempts to comfort her were met by soldiers who separated the family with casual brutality, beginning the process of cataloging and sorting that would determine each person's fate. Zara realized that everything they had fought for, everyone they had tried to save, had been meaningless from the beginning. The infected weren't The escape began not with violence, but with the gentle hand of Dr. Serafina Cross as she administered what appeared to be compliance drugs to her companions but was actually a cocktail of stimulants and adrenaline enhancers she had secretly prepared from her remaining medical supplies. Her years of emergency medicine had taught her that sometimes the most desperate situations required the most calculated risks, and this moment demanded everything she had learned about the human body's capacity for extraordinary performance under extreme duress. The transformation was subtle at first, heightened awareness, increased reaction time, a crystalline clarity of purpose that cut through the paralyzing fear that had gripped them since their capture. Bjorn Ironfeld felt the change first, his massive frame responding to the chemical boost with newfound strength and speed that defied his normal limitations. The construction worker who had spent months protecting others with gentle strength now became something far more dangerous. Zara Nightingale's leadership abilities crystallized into perfect tactical awareness as the stimulants took effect. She could see the patrol patterns of their guards, identify the weak points in the facility's security, and calculate the precise timing needed for 17 people to escape from an underground military installation. The woman who had kept them alive through intuition and determination now operated with the clarity of a born strategist. The breakout erupted with surgical precision. Bjorn's crowbar found the skull of the nearest guard before the man could raise an alarm, while Dante Ashworth, recovered from his tranquilizer dart, moved through the shadows with the focused rage of someone who had already lost everything and refused to lose anything more. His hunting knife found targets with lethal accuracy, each strike motivated by the memory of parents he couldn't save and friends he refused to abandon. Commander Vasquez's reaction was immediate and professional, her orders cutting through the chaos as her enhanced infected responded to coded signals with inhuman speed and coordination. But the survivors were no longer the frightened, desperate people who had been herded into her trap. They moved with purpose and unity, each person understanding their role in an improvised but flawlessly executed plan. Marcus Silverstein shepherded the children toward the emergency exits he had identified during their initial processing, his teacher's instincts combining with enhanced reflexes to navigate the maze of corridors and security systems. Vera Mondane's electronic expertise proved invaluable as she hijacked the facility's communication systems, creating confusion and misdirection that bought precious seconds for their escape. The battle that followed was brief but absolutely savage. Luna and Cassian Reeves fought with the desperate fury of parents protecting their child, their accountant's precision and maternal instincts transformed into lethal efficiency by the knowledge that failure meant worse than death for their daughter. They moved through the facility like angels of vengeance, striking down anyone who threatened their family's freedom. But victory came at a terrible cost. As they reached the surface through a maintenance shaft that led to the ruins of downtown Denver, Serafina Cross collapsed, her body unable to cope with the massive dose of stimulants she had administered to herself. Her sacrifice had given them the chemical edge needed to escape, but it was killing her with each passing moment. "Leave me," she whispered as Bjorn lifted her failing form. "The drugs, too much for my heart. Get the others to safety." But the Norwegian giant simply shook his head, his pale blue eyes fierce with determination. "No one left behind," he said simply, and began carrying her toward the morning light that represented freedom. They emerged into a world that looked different somehow, as if their experience in the underground facility had changed not just them but their perception of everything around them. The infected wandering the streets seemed less threatening now that they understood the true nature of the apocalypse. These weren't victims of random plague but products of deliberate manipulation, and that knowledge changed everything about how they viewed their struggle for survival. Zara led them through the ruins with newfound confidence, her enhanced tactical awareness allowing her to avoid the patrols and surveillance drones that she now knew were searching for them. The facility they had escaped from was just one node in a network of similar installations, but it was also proof that the enemy could be beaten, that humanity's future wasn't predetermined by those who sought to control and transform it. As they reached the outskirts of the city, where mountains rose like ancient guardians against the morning sky, Serafina Cross died in Bjorn's arms, her last words a whispered reminder that hope was worth any sacrifice. The doctor who had sworn to do no harm had given her life to ensure that 17 people could continue fighting for their right to remain human in a world that rewarded only monsters. They buried her in a grove of aspen trees that had somehow survived the collapse of civilization, their golden leaves whispering in the wind like prayers for the dead. The grave marker was simple, a piece of metal scavenged from the ruins, inscribed with her name and the date of a battle that had changed everything. In the months that followed, the survivors became something more than refugees fleeing the apocalypse. They became the nucleus of a resistance movement, sharing their knowledge of the true enemy with other groups of survivors, building networks of communication and cooperation that span the continent. The war for humanity's future was far from over, but for the first time since the outbreak began, they were fighting it with full knowledge of what they faced. Isla Reeves grew up in this new world, her childhood shaped by the understanding that survival meant more than just staying alive, it meant preserving the essential humanity that made life worth living. Her stuffed rabbit, somehow recovered from the facility during their escape, became a symbol of innocence maintained in the face of absolute horror. The ultimate battle for survival continued, but now it was being fought by people who understood that the real enemy wasn't the infected shambling through ruined cities. The real enemy was the willingness to sacrifice humanity for the promise of security, to trade freedom for the certainty of controlled existence. In the end, they had learned that survival meant more than just drawing breath. It meant choosing to remain human when everything in the world conspired to make that choice impossible. And in making that choice, they had won something far more valuable than mere life. They had won the right to hope for something better than the world they had inherited. The war would continue, but they would face it as human beings, carrying the memory of those they had lost and the promise of a future worth fighting for. In a world where humanity itself had become the ultimate battleground, that was both everything and enough. Plague to be survived but a tool being perfected, and their resistance hadn't been heroic but simply part of the data collection process. The ultimate battle for survival wasn't between humans and infected, it was between competing visions of what humanity should become. As soldiers moved to separate and process each member of their group, Serafina Cross made a desperate calculation. Her medical knowledge included information about the sedatives and enhancement drugs she could see being prepared. If they were going to have any chance of resistance, it would have to be now, before the transformation process began and their humanity was stripped away piece by piece. The heart of darkness had revealed itself, and it wore a human face speaking of evolution and improvement while orchestrating the systematic destruction of everything that made life worth living. The war for survival had become a war for the soul of humanity itself, and the enemy had been winning from the very beginning.